things go. I'm glad you joined us for that. Thanks to Bucerius Education, thanks to ELTA who are co-hosting this, and they give me an opportunity to talk about something I'm passionate about, which is our latest research on legal operations. But first of all, I hope you all got your audio on. I have to make one thing sure. We do have a recording of this session. So if any one of you guys feels that they don't want to be recorded or whatever, I think you probably the best and the safest way is you guys leave. However, I'd appreciate if the rest of you would write me a little yes or a Y or whatever in the chat room so that we know we have your consent for recording. And if you don't participate in anything, then of course we won't show you. And yeah, so if you intend to ask a question, just give me a little yes so that we know that you guys will be, are comfortable with us recording this and probably putting it up on the website later on. So here we go. First things first, I got some music for you folks. That should come up in a minute. Okay, anyone who recognizes this wonderful little piece of music? We still take guesses in the chat, but I'm going to reveal that this is the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and we all recognize this wonderful motif of ba 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 ba. I'm bringing this up because there's some classic music on the screen here, and I think it helps us to understand a very important point early on in this presentation. For those of you who are curious, you probably know that it takes about 34 minutes, 42 seconds in total to perform that symphony. It took that much in 1808, so 110 years ago, 2 days before Christmas actually in Vienna, and it will take the same amount of time today. A point being that, that musicians gained exactly no productivity in the entire 210 years since. So they take as long for performing that as they did 210 years ago, which is fine because we like the way they're doing it. And luckily, against popular belief and against normal economic theory, they're also making more money, even if they do not become, haven't become, well, more productive. This is because the rest of the economy has become more productive, and that has helped them to actually elevate their income too. That thing is known as Baumol's cost disease. It's a fairly well understood concept since the 1950s, and it does apply to all those who provide services that are heavy in labor. And that might ring a bell for one or two people in the legal industry, because what we do is also providing those services, and we face some of the same struggles, which is productivity, right? So we all know that there's more and more legal work coming up for all of us, and that is because in other areas of the economy, people are more productive. If you write software or if you produce industrial goods, there's a chance that you're way more productive than you were 10 or 15 years ago. But if you're people heavy, plus expert focused, and if a lot of what you do is not the latest productivity standard, then you'll have trouble coping with it. And I think this productivity challenge for lawyers is what lies at the heart of the phenomenon of legal operations that I'm going to guide you through. So here's what we intend to do today. First of all, a little framework on why you see me and why there's Bucerius coming up. Bucerius Law School and Bucerius Education. We typically and regularly do studies on the legal industries, joined by our partner Boston Consulting Group. They're a big supporter of Bucerius, and that's why we have been able to work together on a number of these projects. Two come to mind as they're fairly recent. That's our 2016 report on legal technology, which you can find here. Let me highlight that for you. And then there's our latest study, which you can find under buceri.us Legal Ops 2018. And it's a nice little write-up of what I'm going to be talking about today, plus some more stuff. And of course, there's more on the websites of Bucerius Education, but if you want to download this, well, buceri.us/legalops 2018 is where you find a lot of this. Very well. So this is what I'm gonna do with you today. First of all, I'd like to present, let me mute that for a second. First of all, I'm going to present some context to what's going on. So just a few mental models to understand how we here at Bucerius are thinking about the legal industry. Then we get into the study and look at what is legal operations, where is it today, so the state. I hope you find that interesting, so I'll explain to you how you actually build that, especially for in-house departments. If you're a legal service provider, you probably want to know what's going on the other side. And then, of course, we have some implications for legal service providers. What does it mean for the people who actually deliver what in-house departments consume? And a final thought on the last mile and everything else, plus a little lookout. Okay, let's go. Context. By the way, if you got questions, anything, make sure to write it in the chat. I won't be monitoring that all the time since I'm concentrating on the slides, but Nadia will be messaging me and telling me if there's anything wrong or if somebody feels that. And by the way, if you feel that something of what I say is wrong, don't hesitate to let me know. Availability heuristics is the worst, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts and maybe adapt what we think accordingly. There we go. Context. If you wonder what lawyers actually do, this is what I come up with. This is what other people come up with. I believe it's lawyers manage legal risk and complexity. And when I talk about complexity, I mean complexity in the sense of complex or complex adaptive systems. So particular effects out of a system with different players that make it hard to predict. If you think about the legal system, some things are easy to predict, like how people act in contractual relationships. We know that. We got contract theory. We get game theory. And then some other things are easy to predict. It's like on the upper level. So how does the economy in general work? Well, we know that people can be regarded as rational there. And so it's not so important what the individual does, as long as we know that the aggregate fits under a theory that we have well understood. The problem lies in between. And this is where I think rubber meets the road here. We need to understand how the behavior of individuals in the legal system, say, for example, a company and its legal advisors, are influencing other parts of the system. If that sounds complicated to you, it is. That's why there's complexity science, and that's math heavy. But I think our job as lawyers is that we really take all of the complexity that is born out of multinational transactions, of a lot of regulatory issues, of more complicated products being brought to market every day, all the legal results of that, and that we somehow make it consumable for the folks who run the businesses or who are busy running their lives. So I think that's what lawyers do. There you go. If we look at this complexity thing now, I have here a wonderful study by a friend of mine, Dan Katz, and they looked at a particular matter of trade law. Well, basically, as a company, you have to file every year with the SEC in the US how many and which pieces of legislation and which governmental bodies are actually going to influence, well, your business in one way or the other. So what they did is they looked at that data. It's all recorded. They went through it with some pretty heavy natural language processing, and they came up with this graphics. And that tells us that from 1994, there were a very small number of acts that people thought might influence their business. And if you look at the 2016 figure up here, well, you see that there's a steady increase. And we're talking like tens of thousands of acts altogether that people think have an impact on their business. So that leads me to believe that legal complexity is actually on the rise. That would be okay, because we know that things are getting more complex, and we have a way of dealing with it. If you look at this wonderful graphics here, this shows us legal complexity over economic growth. And by all means, as H.P. Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This is not a perfect thing, but I think it illustrates my thoughts. So what we believe and what is easy to understand is that, well, since the economy grows, legal complexity increases, and hopefully at the same level, right? This is the red line here. That's what we're used to. So things become more complex, and what we do is we just hire more lawyers or outside law firms. This gave rise to phenomenons like the rise of the large law firm here, let's say up to the 1980s. Then we can see that actually law firms become more profitable, right? Because there's apparently more demand than we can satisfy. So prices go up. But we're probably somewhere here in this phase, realizing that legal complexity is increasing and more people are not the solution. So, and if that complexity goes up at a higher rate than the economic growth rate, well, we're faced with a problem that the money has to come from somewhere, right? If I want to just hire more people to do that, well, I need to make the salary, right? I need to make enough money so that I can pay those people, and that might be a problem. It's a problem now. It's a problem in the future. It might, if this is an accurate prediction of legal complexity going up, we have to find new ways of dealing with it. And one way, of course, is making the individual more productive, because I'm paying that individual already, remember? So productivity really is an issue, and legal operations might be a solution to the productivity challenge, at least in part. Okay, that's mental models. Now let's talk about legal operations and why I'm here. These three innovators here, innovative leaders, are Mario Carroll from Google, Connie Brenton from NetApp, and Stephanie Corey, who used to work for HP and Flex, and now does legal operations consulting. They were part of the leadership team of what's called CLOC down here. It's the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, and probably quite a few folks of you have heard about it. Another big name is the ACC, so the Association of Corporate Counsel, and they're also looking at legal operations as a phenomenon. They have a working group on it. There's tons of good materials on their website, and they brought me to the topic because we realized at Bucerius that the number of legal operations professionals was growing so fast that they actually outgrew San Francisco, where they would typically hold their conventions, and had to move to Las Vegas, which of course is a pretty good thing if you want to have your conference. It's nice to have it in Las Vegas, but they did so because they couldn't just fit in the people. So last year there were over 2,000 people attending Corporate Legal Operations Annual Institute in Vegas, and that made us think, okay, we got to look at this, and we got to somehow figure out what's going on. We did that with the help of Boston Consulting Group, and you see the results in this study. So first off, I've mentioned legal operations a couple of times, so what is it? One way of framing it, of course, is with a negative definition. So the GC of a big German car manufacturing company said, for me, legal operations is everything that's not substantially legal advice. Thought about it and said, okay, I see what he means, but that's probably not as helpful as it gets to actually understand what these people are doing. So we looked at what CLOC does, Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, and this is pretty much what we found. They have a wonderful model. It's 12 core, please don't focus too much on it. It's 12 core competencies on 3 different levels in different colors, and it gives you an overwhelming feeling of everyone who was in the room at the time actually wanted whatever they do in it, and they did it. It's very complete, but it's not easy for first kind of access to it and to understand. Luckily, we're there, and we tried to explain it using this. So our definition of legal operations basically has 3 steps. We start with why. I mean, why are these companies doing it? What are some of the results that you can actually see? Next thing, we thought, like, how do they achieve whatever they're doing? Like, remember, we had the results first, and then we think, how do they do it? And then, of course, the what. So what kind of activities are it? Let's start with the impact, the results. The most prominent one is always resource efficiency, cost effectiveness. Most legal operations teams start out with some person in the company figuring out that legal spends too much money, so they need to reduce cost. That has to do with the rising challenge of legal complexity, and I promise we're going to come back to it later, but that is the most often cited starting point, resource efficiency. Many people, however, would say that's not the most important one, right? The most important one here is that we actually increase the quality of the work done by the legal department and the members of it. And if we can free the legal professionals, so the lawyers in the in-house departments, of some of the tasks, if we can help them better organize their work, well, it actually has an HR component, because suddenly we'll be able to motivate those people a lot better and get better talent retention. So there, of course, other factors that were cited, but I think that frames up why people are doing it. By the way, if I say that were cited, I realize I should say 2 sentences on how we conducted this study. This study is a qualitative one. So we had structured interviews, a little over 50 interviews with different people from the industry, trying to hear their stories, to analyze them, and then to put them together into something that can be called industry best practices. There's, of course, in those analyses, some opinion of ours. We try to keep that back, but it's inevitable that if you summarize and bring together, that some of your perspective flows into it. And we looked at all sorts of quantitative research that had been performed, and that is also part of the study. If you want to look at other things that are out there in the market, I suggest that you keep an eye out for the Center on the Legal Profession of Harvard University. They have a big study going on legal innovation offices, and a lot of what's covered there with regards to in-house is relevant here too. And there's good material out there. I would again suggest that CLOC and the ACC are important sources that are very right in what they're doing. So there we go. We know why they do it. Now we look at what do they actually do. So the first one is vendor management. That is directly to do with resource efficiency, and that's something that many legal professionals can relate to. It basically, if you think of all these pitch process, of all the beauty contests, of procurement, all that is something that typically, if you have a legal operations team, someone at the legal operations team handles, or at least provides the link between the legal department and the procurement department that does that. And this, of course, is not limited to law firms, but it includes all sorts of service providers, vendors. So it might even include technology vendors. Second one's risk management. That's something that many lawyers would say they do in-house. And the assessment of risks through their expert knowledge is something that's featured in the unique skill set of lawyers. However, like accumulating all the information from different parts of the company, bring it all together so that it can be properly assessed by lawyers, and also quantifying the risk from qualitative feedback by individual experts into something that I can show on a dashboard and that I can put a number to. That's typical task of legal operations professionals. Next one would be knowledge management, which is absolute key and center. And I think it's not a particularly new phenomenon, but we all know that as important as it is, there is a tendency of people just not to do it and not to follow through. And it has to be somebody's job to keep those knowledge databases up to date, but also to design the processes so that we make sure they're easy and fun to use. So that part of knowledge management is what legal operations is. And keep in mind that it's even more important for in-house. Because if your knowledge management is not 100% in law firm, and you end up giving out the exact same advice, let's say with 2 or 3 years in between, because you don't know you have already given it out, you're still paid. However, if you're on the in-house side, well, then it does not make sense to actually pay twice for something you already knew. So there might be a stronger incentive. Still, we see that as long as it has been around, adoption is not where we would like it to be. And that's why we need legal operations professionals here. The next one would be budget management. This is fairly straightforward. It means aligning the legal department's budget with the overall budget of the company. It means understanding the key performance indicators. And it's typically an activity of legal operations professionals because the average lawyer does not have the skill set and the finance background to do it. And there's, of course, technology management, by which I mean horizon scanning, figuring out what technology is out there, which one might be employed, but then also the implementation of it. Because, well, it needs to be someone's job. Somebody has to focus on it, and you need a little more tech skills than your average lawyer. So these management functions that we got here, in total, are our take on what legal operations mainly does. So I've got 3 more levers for you on how they perform these tasks. First one being data analytics. And here I'm talking really about the statistics and math science. So if you want to take all these risks and build models to know whether or not to act, you need data analytics. If you want to come up with an interesting pricing model for your outside vendors, in vendor management. You need data analytics. And that has a technology part, of course, but that also has a math part. And that's one of the important levers that we've been hearing again and again from people we talk to. Next one, next trick, if you want, is intra and interfunctional collaboration. Sounds easy, but we all know that it can get lost in the day-to-day business, and really unlocking the benefits of being an entire company with an IT department, with a sales department, is how legal operations professionals tackle some of the tasks that we got in the column on the left. And the last one is process improvement. And this is classic stuff. So I'm talking Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, but also just visualization of processes and making sure that you don't do the same job twice. Through these levers, right here in the middle, these results here are achieved. And on the left-hand side, these are the techniques. These are the areas in which they are achieved. I'm sorry for the long slide. I'm happy to see that we still got 24 people with us. And I know it's a lot. So let's get a bit more concrete. On the impact side, what did we find as interesting results of legal operations? I got two numbers first, a very big one, which is 50%, and I'm talking about turnaround time. So we've seen a case where instead of taking 7 days to complete a contract review for a complex sales operation per contract, the legal department could reduce it to 3.5 days. And that is pretty impressive, because suddenly you only need half of the time to perform the job, and the salespeople out there can sell, at least from the legal department's perspective, twice as many things. And in this case, we could all actually see how that impacted the bottom line and the end financial result of the company. And then I got a rather small number here on the left, which is 5%. But it's only small because it's a percentage of the entire annual legal costs of said company. So this includes outside spend, this includes inside personnel, and it included building the legal operations team, which required investments. So that's actually a pretty impressive number from one of the cases in one of the companies we've seen. There are other results that are impressive in themselves, but of a more limited scope. I mean, if you're doing budget management, for example, the 50% budget predictability, so you actually meet your target way more often, is something that's important. Of course, up here is outside counsel spend. So a 30% reduction in that, if you're heavy on outside counsel spending, is important. But these are only a few examples of what we've seen in the marketplace. Results achieved and attributed by the people who actually made them possible to legal operations. Coming to the second part, the state of legal operations, I'll quickly have a quick look in the chat to see if there's anything that we need to address at this point in time. There we go. Okay, no, looks good. You're all set. Then let's continue with the state of legal operations. So again, findings from our interviews plus desk research on the matter. When we try to put in some order and figure out, so where are the stars? Like, how far is it in different industries? What are common factors of successful and less successful legal operations implementations? We found these three factors. First being industry sector. So there are industry sectors that are at the front, and there are reasons for that, into which you'll get in a minute. Then there is second most important factor, which is legal department size. So this is not company size, but legal department size. Generally speaking, the bigger the legal department, the more likely they got a big legal operations team, probably because legal operations really scales. And so we'll get into that in a minute too. And the last one is a geographic point. It's the weakest slide because it's only a map, but I promise that once we get there, I'll give you a number of the reasons why the current state says that there are champions on the American side of the Atlantic, and Europe and Australia are following, but there's also legal operations in the rest of the world. Anyway, let's talk about industry sectors. We get two industry sectors particularly strong in legal operations. One is highly regulated industries. They were actually the first. This is East Coast stuff, right? So it's not yet tech, but it's banking, it's insurance, it's healthcare. They were the first to actually see the rise in legal complexity, to actually live with an increasing number of regulations. And that's because they are probably close to consumers and they have a lot of things to comply with. And they typically have many contracts. So what they do here is they typically tend to have legal as an important function with a lot to say in their core business. Think of telecommunications companies, and I'll come up with an example in a minute. And they encountered the cost first. They encountered the problem first, and so they were early to provide or to integrate legal operations teams. Second sector is technology. For them, it's different because regulation is not that intense in most markets. But what they do is they take what is at the core of their company, which is standardizing and scaling good solutions, and then applying that to all parts of their company, including the legal department. Plus, of course, there's general spirit of technology friendliness among these people. So tech is the second biggest sector. And then we have more conservative sectors who feel less regulatory pressure, who are probably not as litigious because they typically have bigger contracts that are negotiated out and not typically litigated out. And they are working at a somewhat slower pace if you compare it to tech, for example. However, we still find amazing examples like ThyssenKrupp, which is a big German industrial conglomerate that does some interesting stuff. Or if you look at some of the big oil companies in the world, they also have legal operations going on. So this is a general idea, but of course there are counterexamples. Second maturity factor is the size of the legal department. And you'll realize that that is, of course, sometimes linked to the industry sector too. So what we found is the bigger the legal department, the more likely you are to have a legal operations team. That's typically because the bigger your legal problem, let's say your number of litigations, the bigger your legal department is. And it's when you're faced with just a high value of legal complexity that you have to do something about it. And so legal operations comes into play. As I said before, it's not necessarily that these are big companies. Of course, big companies do have more headcount in their legal departments, but we're really talking about the part or the part of the legal headcount towards the total headcount that matters. And as a general trend, we can say that the maturity of legal operations, so there are different phases and all, you'll find that on the ACC website, but you'll see that only the biggest departments actually are today reaching the last phase, which is the most deepest implementation and the most advanced implementation. And it has to do, of course, with budget reasons too, because some things you can only develop when they really scale, and the bigger your department, the better they scale. Here's the geography slide I promised you. So the entire thing here is that the US, Canada, Northern America are really ahead, with Europe and Australia following. And we see some development in Asia. We have not looked specifically at Africa and South America. And so when it's gray there, it's not necessarily said that they are not in the game. It's just that we didn't focus on that. So what are some of the reasons why we're in the deep red here? We think a couple of things have to do with what I already mentioned. There's another litigation culture in the US than in Europe, for example. So there's more individual claims being brought up. Mass claims, class actions are something that is pretty day-to-day stuff in the US and a very new phenomenon in Europe. There's a general affinity for technology and less skepticism. And of course, there's an effect of self-perpetuation. So once in your home market, many companies start employing these teams, well, as a company, you get under pressure because you don't want to lose out. So you also do it. And of course, if you look at the sector concentration, just some of the biggest tech companies and highly regulated companies come from North America. So there is that cultural difference part, and there's the part that correlates with the other factors. But for the time being, we can say that if you want to see where these things are headed, and if you want to see where things are going on, have a look at the US and Canada. But in Europe, we already see things starting, and there we've talked to people from all over Asia, and you will see legal operations being an important topic there as well. Okay, after roughly 30 minutes, I thought you guys are ready for a story. So I'll tell you a quick one about BT. If you've read, there's a case study that Harvard did, and we have interviewed Chris Fowler. Back then, they interviewed Dan Fitz. You'll learn in a minute who that is. But if you want to read up on that on a more, in silence at a moment where you're ready to read 20 pages, read the Harvard case study. I'll give you the talking points here. You probably know BT. BT, they used, they're a telephone company, right? So today they do telecommunications, consumers, and B2B. And they really were in trouble when the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, writing down £1 billion contracts in 2009 alone, and then seeing another 2 billion year-on-year revenue decline in 2009. So they were financially in trouble. CEO at the time, Ian Livingston, decided that everyone had to save money and had to save money in the long run, and that a 20% emergency staff reduction in the legal department would not be enough. By the way, those jobs were not lost in the UK, where trade unions prohibited that because they had a deal, but in the international team. And since it's a global company, that means many people losing their job. And Dan Fitz became the new general counsel and had the job of somehow realizing saving a lot of money and still not decreasing the service level that everyone was used to. You guys will remember that BT falls into the category of highly regulated industries, so legal had a lot to say. And we're going to look at how Dan Fitz and Chris Fowler, who we see here on this side, how they did it. Chris Fowler, back then, was in charge of a subdivision, is now the general counsel for the UK operations, and he was one of the early adopters and one of the people we talked to in the study. As a little side information, all that I'm talking to you about now is, of course, is something that BT has agreed us to share. So if we ever call you and interview you, I want to know your opinion. It's typically confidential until we build a case study like we did here. So what did they do? Well, first of all, they cut down the fragmentation of the legal department. When they started 2010, legal department at BT was at roughly, I think, 66 different units. And they were integrated with the business units and with other parts of the company. So basically everyone had their own little lawyer on the table, and they liked that. So that was something they had to change. To do so, they applied what's called blue sky sessions, which means everyone gets together and comes up with ideas, no matter your role or where you are in the hierarchy. And in 2010, that was something big for BT because it was a hierarchical company. These sessions, however, would help to identify the right people, those with the ideas and also the guts to actually make them a reality. The idea was to declutter, if you want to use Marie Kondo terms, and leave your lawyers with the legal work that sparks joy for them and hand out all the other stuff to an outside legal services provider. So they built a process that was called legal front door. That's over here. And legal front door really was a website where you had to state your legal problem as a business unit. And then there would be a rule-determined decision on whether or not this was going to reach your central legal department or someone at a legal process outsourcing company. I think in the beginning they were with United Lex, and then after some years went over to Axiom. And so that was a change for the business people, right? Because suddenly they couldn't just call up their buddy in legal, but they had to go through a website. But it took about 6 months until people started really using it. And they were happy with it because the requests that went to the legal process outsourcing folks, they were handled and dealt with very professionally. The reason for that being that BT had spent quite some time at process mapping all sorts of different requests and typical legal work, and then taking all that into a play and writing it into a playbook so that the legal process outsourcing company knew what to do. Through this system that really is a load balancing system, so to speak, in technical terms, they would make sure that the right work went to the lawyers in-house and the right work went to the outside provider. Now, how did they know what sort of work needed to go where? Well, they did what's called an overhead value analysis, an overhead cost value analysis. So they just looked at everything that they did 1 week in September, wrote it down, how much time it took them, and then figured out how much business value it actually added. And then they only kept what was really important. So what really needed company expertise remained within BT. Standard stuff, commoditizable stuff went to the outside provider, and the high risk issues such as pensions, for example, or big litigation, that went to law firms. And just by reorganizing who did what sort of work, they were able to achieve some pretty impressive results that we're going to talk about in a minute. First of all, let me tell you why that was successful. There are 4 key success factors that we've seen. One is they started small. If you read through the case studies and the interviews, they tackled points that lawyers could see results early on, but that did not touch the core value of the company. As I said before, they identified the right people, change agents, in blue sky sessions. And Dan Fitz and his team were particularly good at helping people understand that nobody's job was at risk. Remember, they came when 20% of the jobs had just been cut. So there was a culture of fear that you might lose your jobs. They came in and they provided a good alternative, saying we need to make these changes, but then everyone can keep their job. And the last one is they very early on were able to put a price tag to things. They knew what kind of work took how long. We have the overhead value analysis here. We also have very reliable financial numbers that showed how year over year they achieved their results. So these quantitative methods were probably the keystones why they were able to continue their process year over year. As Dan Fitz, former company secretary, put it, collect data was the only way to win arguments in BT, because we got to remember that people didn't want to change, right? They had their lawyer, they were happy with it, they were available, and they didn't want to centralize it and then go through websites. So only if you could show that there are business results, you're saving money and things are getting quicker, you could successfully implement it. I brought you a number of results that you can have a look on later on if you want. I think the interesting thing here is that we have 10% year-on-year cost reduction in one of the teams, the commercial team, which was the biggest of BT at the time. But what we also see is that after a while, 2/3 of the requests that went through this website were directly handed off to the legal process outsourcer. So that's big, because that means 2/3 of the claims that came in didn't see the in-house lawyers, and people were still happy with it. If you maybe look at this final number here, between 2010 and 2015, commercial spend, so spend relates to commercial contracts and commercial litigation, was down 90%, which is substantial, and which is why they were able to achieve it year over year. There's much more to say about BT, and you can look it up in our case study in the report. But the impressive thing is that they had these results and that they continued to innovate, and that even today, if you talk to Chris Fowler, they're still fighting change fatigue successfully and make sure that they can achieve those results year over year, and develop a pretty mature legal operations team. By the way, 15 people working in legal operations at BT end of last year, just to give you an idea. Okay, so I hope by now I have given you a flavor of why people do that and why they maybe want to do it. I'll have a look at the chat, but I see no questions so far. So we quickly get into the section of how do I achieve that? Or how do my clients achieve that? So here's what we find. There are a couple of things you need to get sorted before you can get started. These are the key prerequisites. This is what you need if you want to start a legal operations function. We're going to get from right to left here. Key is that someone up in the hierarchy, best as general counsel or C-suite, supports it. And people have to know about that. Everyone in the company has to know, and the department has to know that this is something that bosses care about. This is something that's important in the company's strategy, because it will require people to change their behavior, and they have to have an incentive. And quite often, the people they look up to and the people they receive orders from, if they're convinced it's a good idea, well, it might convince other people. You do need the financial resources, of course. You can bootstrap it to a certain extent, but sometimes it means hiring people. Sometimes it means holding sessions, and you got to pay for that, right? So there's some financial resources required. It doesn't go without IT expertise. A lot of the tools that are used require someone with an in-depth knowledge of the legal department and a good enough knowledge of IT to come to life. So IT expertise is something you need to secure before you can start your efforts. Two more things. One is organizational design. This is something that we go into more deeply if we have in-house sessions, but what really works is a centralized legal function. So if you get a legal department, it really works out. If you have what's called embedded lawyers, that's a very viable strategy for tackling new problems and for like finding legal solutions in an innovative product design process, but it's terrible for legal operations because you need scalability and you need some degree of centrality to do that. If you look into our report, we suggest a matrix structure that can even help with huge international companies, but organizational design needs to somehow lend itself to legal operations if you want it to be successful. And of course, there's staffing, something I'm genuinely interested as a law school. Let's just say that that's probably the most important decision, who you bring on. There is in our study an entire chapter on what kind of skills you need. And I'll make it quick here and say that there's of course hard skills. We've seen math and IT skills. And then of course there's knowledge of the legal department. And finally, a lot of soft skills around change management. I won't have time to go into that here, but staffing is a key factor. So if we looked at all the case studies we did and the interviews we did, what would be the success factors they got in common? We came up with 4, and you know them. One is quantitative methods, right? So that's something, keep in mind that the overhead value analysis, for example, is something that goes into that area, or just being able to measure your results. Then we have to identify the right change agent. So that's not necessarily the CEO or the sponsor, but we need the right people in the department that can convince others to go ahead and help them. The next thing is divide and conquer. So gradual implementation is what distinguishes successful legal operations implementations from less successful ones. And then there's a networking aspect to it. If you look at them individually, there we go. I think we've talked about quantitative methods. This is for your reference later on. It's important that you're able to track your progress, and it's important to use these as they provide very valuable basis for arguments in the change process. We've talked about change agents as well. This means senior management, but it also means agents on every single level of the company, people who can motivate others to do the necessary work. And it's very important to involve the lawyers, so the people whose jobs are changed here early on. The gradual implementation process is important to show your value to the company, and because it only under very few circumstances, a new idea is applied to the core high revenue parts of the company first. People want to see results, people want to see tryouts, and that's why we start one step at a time. And networking is something that every single person we talked to said was very important. Just sharing experiences with your peers, going to CLOC and ACC events, they're not very costly for in-house folks. Hearing what they do and constantly interact with each other. That's the whole idea why Stephanie and Connie founded CLOC in the first place. So is everything fine and happy? Probably not. We've seen a number of pain points, so things that can go wrong. I'll just name them here and give you, and it's important to know them because you can probably avoid them then. One is, well, legal quite often in traditional companies are seen as a cost center. So the need to save money to become more efficient or better is sometimes simply not seen. And that's something that needs to change in people's minds. Then there is lawyers. And I wrote before lawyers are skeptical, but that's not true. Lawyers are trained to detect risks. And in these changes, in these organizational changes, all sorts of risks are inherent. So it's very easy to pick apart plans for integration of a legal operations function. People don't mean it. It's just what they are trained to do and what is typically the very valuable contribution to the company. So it's important to be aware of that, and also to make others aware of the fact that there is risk involved and that you know it, but that you still want to do it. Legal content can be difficult to standardize, especially because it's also operationally fragmented. So there's a lot of different tasks, different people applying different things, or different techniques, solving different problems. It is standardizable. And we've seen large numbers of companies that have standardized parts of it, but it's not something that lends itself to standardization as, say, finance does. And I think that's why it's important to think about that. It might be unknown territory for the CEO, so there might be a clash of cultures, because these days CEO typically come through the CFO track, and that comes from other departments than legal. So just keep that in mind, that the person at the top of the company might be unfamiliar with what this department is. And then if you look at change processes in big companies and how they are taken, they tend to be slower than the technological development. And so if you focus too much on two big pieces of technology, once someone has decided that you want to go with it, the market might be a whole iteration further. And you might run into trouble because technology is developing quicker than you make decisions. These are frequent pain points. Again, more of them in our report. I continue to see, there we go. I see a question. Did you also find too high expectation of legal operations? I guess that's a question. So quickly, somebody asked, what about the expectation management and whether or not we found that people did not achieve the results and goals? And my answer is a clear yes. I'll give you Maria Carroll from Google, who said that, well, her first task was to figure out how much Google owed to individual law firms and what would happen if one of the firms went into trouble. And so that was just a dashboard, like, where are we? And she thought that would be done within a couple of weeks' time. And anecdotally, she says, so only 6 years later, I was able to finally provide that information. So that is maybe why we stress the gradual implementation bit so much, saying that it's important to keep these expectations realistic. And there are cases where people expect big global changes to take place only because of legal operations, and that does not happen because of these factors here. So we did find these cases, but the majority of people that we talked to were very happy with their implementation. Anyway, let's quickly talk about the implication for legal service providers. So first big legal service provider is, of course, law firms. These principles, as they apply to legal operations, to the in-house departments, of course, apply to law firms too. So all these techniques and what people are doing, the activities, they could play a role in legal operations in law firm too. It would be beneficial because it will distinguish one firm from the other, and those firms who have started implementing these say that it puts them on eye level with their in-house clients, and it's helpful to have a counterpart for legal operations people from in-house in your law firm. So it's a good idea to actually think about it if you're a law firm too. It might be necessary to think about it because they are the other folks, the new legal service providers. They're probably further ahead in their operational development of the business. And so when legal departments are actually coming up with these legal operations teams, that is just a prerequisite for legal service providers. So new legal service providers, alternative legal service providers, taking part of the business. So we see a clear risk as well for big law firms. By the way, we also see a chance between these two because at least from the stories we heard, there were on more than one occasions collaborations where the legal department gave part of the work to new legal service providers and part to the big law firm. And those two providers also collaborated and were able to leverage each other's strengths. Well, one, of course, access to clients and substantial law expertise on the big law firm side. And then, of course, the operational advantages that new legal service provider might have. Why is this important? Well, it is so because what we're seeing through legal operations is really an unbundling of law as a product. So as a client, I don't only get substantial legal expertise. I get it through some form of technology in a particular way. So in a particular process, as a particular end result. And of course, on the delivery side, I pay for it in some sort of business scheme. By the way, this is from another Dan Katz piece, the MIT School of Law. I suggest everyone reads it. It's really good. And if you don't know what I do, 40 pages, it's probably time well spent. So with all the unbundling, that's something that Richard Susskind describes, that many people who look at the industry are describing. Law firms traditionally offer all of this, while other providers only offer part. But if now in-house departments get ready to receive only part of this legal product and to give it to different providers, well, that's why we see a certain risk for law firms if they can't, or if they don't adopt a business model that meets those parts on the other side. Give you Chris Fowler again, who says something that's changed greatly over the last 5 years. It's the increased time discussions we're, as a legal department, are spending on how we manage the legal function, which I think is significant, because over at BT, but at other companies, management of legal function really is becoming a job, and that has had implications for the other providers. I do have a bit less than 10 minutes left. And I think I have an important little scenario, but if you guys really feel you want to share something, or you want to ask a question, we can also do that now, since the three slides I got left contain all that you need to know about the scenario and a link where to read it up. And I want to make sure that you have ample time to ask questions. Very well, so here we go. Okay, so here's a question from Mads. So you mentioned two maturity factors, and inquire on their relation to the legal front door system. I think there is substantial investment involved when you develop that, right? You have to change a lot of processes in individual parts of the company, and you have to build the system. You have to then decide what sort of work goes to whom, and you have to come up with what these people should do once they get the work. So I do believe that the legal department size matters. I think the benefits are bigger if it's a big legal department, but it's easier to implement if it's a smaller company and earlier on. So you get a classic yes, but or no, but answer from me. I believe it would work notwithstanding the size of the organization, but it requires a certain size to justify the work behind it, and to justify the preparations that go into that. Yeah, that's my question. Seeing no other questions at this point in time, and Nadia, if I'm missing out something, I just interject. Okay, that's sure, thanks. I'll give you the last mile problem and some of the rest. So this one is famously put by Bill Henderson, whose blog Legal Evolution you should absolutely read. And he comes up with a hypothetical scenario in which he first looks at a law firm and then looks at an in-house department. We're going to do that in the last couple of minutes, because I want to go back to the original productivity problem, and I think it explains why we're not further ahead than we are at the moment. So productivity, as we've seen, all these measures, they require money and they require time and they require people to change their behavior. And that's not easy. So in economic terms, there's just high investment cost. And Bill says, let's look at it from a law firm perspective. And let's just imagine that it would be very easy. Well, all we need is a box where you put in 10 hours of work and you get out 20 hours. So it's a 10 in, 20 out box, right? It's a hypothetical. So the law firm wonders, should it build it or not? And they think, okay, if we build it, it's going to cost money or time of people. That translates into money. But for this hypothetical, it's going to cost money. And then they think, okay, so how do we justify the investment? I mean, we all picture the partners meeting and they say, okay, let's say it costs $5 million. How do we make sure that we get a return on investment? They look at monetization strategies. And well, suddenly they can do all the work in half the time. So one way of approaching the client is telling them, hey, good news, we can do all your work and you only pay us half of the time. So you save 50%. And you can all imagine how well that goes in the partner meeting, because suddenly you've just reduced the income by 50%. Or you say, you know, we're so much more productive, we're just going to double our rate, our hourly rate. And then you guys are going to pay for that, and we can take in more work, and then we make twice the money. And we can all imagine how that goes with clients who are like trying to reduce cost. And of course, the solution is that some of the work is handled quicker, and therefore the company will give more work to the lawyers, because in the end, all the money for all the law firms only comes from clients. And clients, as we're going to see in a second here, face the same problem. But explaining that, and explaining maybe that the client will have to take part of the investment of the $5 million, and working out such a model is really complex technical sales. It's a hard process. Clients probably are skeptical, say, well, build it first, and then we'll figure out later on whether we want to use it. And once it's proven that it works, we take it then. And then in the end, we all know what is the easy solution, right? Just don't do it, and you charge by the hour, and you live with the profitability, with the productivity you got. And that's okay for the law firm, right? Because they still make the same amount of money. And now we look at the other side. It's okay, what about Acme? Acme is our company here, and Acme, I think, in Bill's hypothetical, they produce wonderful electronic goods. They're a good, healthy company. They grow 5% year over year, which is something that you can see in the graphics here. So 5% revenue growth year over year. They have about $10 million in legal budget. And they have, I think, 10,000 units of legal complexity they handle with those $10 million, right? So as long as the legal complexity grows in the same rate as the company grows, that's okay. Because you'll see an increase in budget here, year over year. That's the gray line, which you can take from the overall revenue increase. But the problem happens if, let's say in our hypothetical here, legal complexity grows by 10% and not by 5%. And you'll see that from year 2 on here, there's a difference between these two. And in the end, we're nearly at 14.6 million legal complexity dollars versus only about $12.1 million to solve them. So companies in trouble because they somehow need to still either need to take risks that they don't want to take, or they need to drive down the cost per unit of risk. And that's something that I'll show you guys here on the right-hand side. Year over year, the per unit cost, so the cost per unit of legal complexity needs to go down, because otherwise they cannot manage with a 5% increase in budget and 10% increase in legal complexity. So how does it go down? Well, there's 3 strategies. One is you go to your law firm, you say, listen up, guys. I only got, you name it, 10 million. So you got to become cheaper. That is called discounts. And that's something I hear is happening from time to time in the legal industry. Or you just take all the in-house, you all take all the law firm lawyers and bring them in-house. So you practically pay them less and then provide them with some other benefits that companies can provide lawyers better than law firms, like, I don't know, childcare and time and leisure time and all that. And then you just hope that the same person becomes more productive because you pay them less money. And that's true to a certain extent. But if you remember the very first graphic I showed you, is that more people, or people who become a little bit cheaper, are not going to solve the problem. So what really would solve the problem here is, of course, our 10 in, 20 out box, right? Or 20 in, 10 out, depending on how you want to look at it. But the law firm didn't build it because the sales process was so hard, and the company didn't want to invest in it because they weren't sure of the outcome. So that's the dilemma. That's what Bill calls the legal's last mile problem. And well, what's the solution then? And that's really the last slide before I let you guys go. Solution is that you got to talk about it. Here at Bucerius, we have a format that's called an open innovation lab. And that brings people together who are all facing the same productivity problem. And let's just have them exchange on how to best address it. And Microsoft, and this, by the way, is Jason Barnwell here, handsome fella. He took it one step further, and he did what's called Microsoft's Trusted Advisor Forum. That is, Microsoft put together all their advisors, all their law firms, and said, let's get together and you guys share one idea on how to better work on a Microsoft case next year and one from last year. And nearly everyone came. I mean, I hear that 3 or 4 law firms declined to come, but everyone else came and presented in front of all the other law firms and a number of clients that Microsoft brought, because it might really be a good incentive to bring people who can actually provide business to such a thing. And then they held this, and they're going to redo it every 6 months as a form of structured dialogue between client and firms. And the end result of that will be, of course, complex technical sales, because Microsoft knows it's going to pay for these innovations, and the firms know that they want to keep Microsoft's business. And so my message here is, it's not a cost issue, even though it might look like one. It's a productivity issue. It's tough to solve. We can really solve it together. Legal operations is one of the challenges, one of the answers to these challenges. And if you're curious to know more, to look deeper into it, you'll find the slides to this presentation under buceri.us legal ops slides, and you find the entire report under buceri.us legal ops 2018, which you find on the first slide of these slides. Of course, we can provide you with the link to these slides as well. That's me, and that was the presentation from my end. Any more questions?
Seems not.
Yeah, that's okay. I hope you guys are still with us. A couple of people had to leave. Somebody says thank you for the presentation. That's very kind. I hope you liked it. On this very last slide, you have my Twitter handle. That's @thesoundofthefun. You also got my email address. Hit me an email with any thoughts, and make sure you come around next time when ELTA and Bucerius do fun stuff again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk, very much for this interesting lunch lecture, and wish you all a nice day and hope to see you again.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.